Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galucki, and welcome to the 388th Imagine Buffalo program, and another great virtual Imagine lecture hosted by the Downtown Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Thanks so much for joining us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art and Architecture, History, and Nature with an acronym of Cezanne and ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Now we're going to start with our speaker shortly, but first, a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted during our speaker's presentation, which will last about 15 to 20 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can. This program is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it again later on the library's Facebook and the library's YouTube channel pages. An audio of this program and over 1,000 other programs since 2010 from Buffalo and Chautauqua can be found at the Cezanne audio catalog at ImagineLifelongLearning.com. As a reminder, we'll be here on Zoom every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. using the same link as today with a great lineup of local speakers. Today is the fourth Tuesday of the month, so our topic is nature and science, and our featured speaker is Kathy Leacock. Catherine Leacock has degrees in anthropology and library science from the University at Buffalo. She joined the staff of the Buffalo Museum of Science in 2003. She began her museum career as the curator of the Charles Rand Penny Collection, a private collection in Western New York. Experience in the private sector, in addition to public institution, provides Kathy with a well-rounded view of museums. Kathy also served as the interim director of museum studies at SUNY Buffalo State before returning to her true love of collections management. Kathy is currently the director of collections at the Buffalo Museum of Science and lecturer of museum studies at Buffalo State. Now, let's welcome Kathy Leacock.
Thanks, Dennis. All right, let's see if I can get my technology to work for me today. Oop. All right, off to a good start. So funnily enough, the last time I was in the Imagine hot seat was 2012. So I figure it's like jury duty and you have to do it every 8 years. So watch out for those of you who are coming up on your 8-year anniversary. Dennis still has your email address. So good afternoon, and thank you for spending your lunch break with me today as we learn a little bit more about mummies and the Buffalo Museum of Science. Hopefully many of you will have already had the chance to see the exhibit since it opened in February, closed in March, reopened in July. Again, the story of 2020. And if you haven't yet, hopefully today's overview will be just the catalyst that you need to get your tickets before it closes on January 3rd. Golden Mummies of Egypt is presented by M&T Bank. It is a world premiere exhibition at the Buffalo Museum of Science, and it examines the sort of broad theme is that it examines the hopes and fears about the afterlife when Egypt was part of the Greek and Roman worlds. So we're looking at the time period of about 30 BCE to about AD 300. At that time, gods were believed to have flesh made of gold. And so wealthy members of society had their mummified remains also encased in gold in the hopes of joining those gods in the afterlife. The exhibition features 100 key objects from the Manchester Museum's collection at the University of Manchester in the UK. It includes 8 mummies, as well as masks, coffins, and sculpture. The exhibit itself was curated by Dr. Campbell Price, who is the curator of Egyptology at the Manchester Museum. So much of the content that I'm going to talk about today is taken from materials from the exhibit, and therefore also those provided by Dr. Price. Before we delve in, of course, if you know me, you know I always have to, show how nothing is ever new. So let's think about, if you've been to the museum, a quick historical review of mummies in Buffalo before we get to the golden ones. So for those of you who remember seeing mummies at the museum, when was the last time? We've actually had Egyptian mummies at the exhibit at the museum since 1964. Most of the two of the mummies that have been on display at the museum are actually from the collection of the Buffalo History Museum. And most recently, you may be familiar with the more immersive exhibit, Wemank, the Cycle of Life in Ancient Egypt, which was a long-term exhibit at the museum that ran from 1998 until 2013. And Wemank was designed in-house and developed by the museum and featured their collection along with loans. But what the big idea behind Wemank was it focused on everyday life in ancient Egypt. It was everyday life of sort of middle-class Egyptians during the Ptolemaic period. So these mummies are older than those that are on display right now. And then again in 2013, we welcomed another exhibit, Mummies of the World, which focused on mummification processes from around the globe. A lot of times we think about mummies, we immediately go to Egypt, but Mummies of the World showed that there are mummified remains from all continents. So how does the current installation differ? In so many ways. So Golden Mummies of Egypt showcases one of the richest Greco-Roman collections to have ever been discovered. It looks specifically at the lives of the elite in this very multicultural time period in Egyptian history. And the mummies were once living people, and they represent just a small subset of the Egyptian population during the Greco-Roman time period. So the University of Manchester Museum is recognized to have one of the finest collections of Greco-Roman material outside of Cairo. And this collection was excavated at a time when Egypt was under British rule from the 1880s till the 1920s. So it was excavated during a period of time when it was common for scholars to excavate human remains. Of course, that has changed significantly over time, but we have to bear in mind the context of this particular exhibition. So the many thousands of Egyptian antiquities that are now in museums around the world did not arrive there by chance. Archaeologists, workmen, collectors, and patrons all played their part. So British colonial control of Egypt, especially between 1882 and the 1920s, enabled Western archaeologists to excavate at sites and claim a share of the finds from the Egyptian government. So if you acquired the rights to excavate in Egypt during the 19th century, half of what you found stayed with the Egyptian government, and you were permitted to take half of your finds back to your country of origin and deposit them in a research institution. So that's how the Manchester Museum acquired this particular collection. And that's the same in the US with our national museums. Ancient Egyptian material culture is always very desirable to a Western audience. So the collections that we were looking at today are primarily from the site of Hawara, which is right up here. In the US, most mummies in US institutions come from this site, the site of Akhmim, but we're actually a little further north today, and we're at Hawara. This site is located in a very fertile area in Egypt, because not only do you have the Nile, but you have this tributary close to it, which is known as the Fayum Oasis. And so this area was popular to a lot of Greek and Roman farmers and others that settled here, making it, just another aspect of the multiculturalism that's going on right here. So in 1888, this site was excavated by a British archaeologist by the name of Flinders Petry, and he discovered at Hawara a vast necropolis, and he located over 146 portraits, which were on the coffins that dated to this Roman period. And those became known as the Fayum portraits, and we'll see some of those in a minute. So the archaeologist, with his lots, has to have a double barrel name, Sir William Matthew Flinders Petry, first went to Egypt in 1883 and went to Giza, which is where a lot of archaeologists started. But he then he was attracted to the site of Hawara because he had read an account by a Greek historian that said there was a labyrinth at Hawara. And so he ventured outside of Cairo in order to try and find what this Greek historian was talking about. So Petry secured funding from two wealthy businessmen and began working at the site of Hawara in 1888. Petry's workmen started to unearth much later objects than he was expecting. What turned out to be a Greco-Roman cemetery with tens of thousands of burials. Petry only retained a small portion of what was excavated, and many of those mummies were covered in gold, which was very unusual. And then also the mummies that were found to have these portraits. And so this inspired Petry to keep going at Hawara. And he brought some of his finds back to England, and they caused a bit of a sensation among art historians because they weren't what Western audience was used to seeing when we think about material that's excavated in Egypt because of this Greek and Roman influence. So both private donors and public institutions wanted to collect this part of Egyptian history. And so Petry didn't have a problem getting funding to continue his excavations at this site. So select objects from sites like Hawara, as I mentioned, were kept at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, but many were allowed to leave Egypt and ended up in museums around Europe and the United States. Petry is sometimes remembered as the father of Egyptian archaeology, but it's not just him, right? He employed hundreds of Egyptian workers who actually did the hard work of the excavation. But Petry himself was very good at recording his finds than many of his contemporaries. So we do have his field notes, scans of which that are on exhibit in the show that show the detailed field notes that he wrote while he was at Hawara. So not to the standards of modern archaeologists, but of his time, he was exceptional in his note taking. So in his long career, Petry was particularly proud of his discovery of the mummy portraits, perhaps because they blended this Greek and Roman faces along with the fascination of ancient Egyptian mummies. So, but there's still lots to be known, and there's actually a research project out of the Getty that really studies these more in detail, the Fayum portraits. So this is really hard to see, but a brief timeline. Egypt has had numerous foreign rulers throughout the country's history. So this image is difficult to see, but we're just looking today at one small piece of this long and engaging timeline. Alexander the Great was just one in a line of pharaohs born outside of Egypt. His arrival in 332 BC brought about 3 centuries of rule by non-Egyptians, by Macedonian and Greek kings, which became known as the Ptolemies or the Ptolemaic dynasty. With the death of the last ruler of this dynasty, Cleopatra VII in 31 BC, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire for an additional 4 centuries. So it's this era that we're focused on with this particular exhibition. So Greeks had been a significant component of Egypt's mercenary forces from the 7th century onwards, and many settled in those commercial centers. And again, around Fayum area because of the agricultural land of the region. So it is against this historical background that we invite visitors to step back to 1888 when Flinders Petry secures his funding to excavate at Hawara. He records his findings in his field notes, and quotations from those journals are included in the exhibition. We ask that visitors think about how Flinders Petry's perceptions differ from our understanding today. And because we know that science is a process, it's always changing, and new evidence is uncovered, our language and our terminology changes. So it is our hope that by looking at Petry's 19th century observations, and we can stimulate a discussion about the changing role of collectors, collections, and colonialism in museums. So with this in mind, let's take a look at a sample of the mummies currently having an extended stay in Buffalo. First, we meet Arta Madurus. Flinders Petry claimed that this mummy was found as part of a family group at Hawara. As you can see on the coffin cover, it is decorated with what we would recognize as Egyptian funerary symbols. But what's interesting is you always also see text. Right here, we see some Greek text, and that says Arta Madurus, farewell. So during the Greco-Roman period, preparations for death and the afterlife were influenced, as you can see here, by Greek and Roman traditions. Greek and Romans prior to this time had a pretty bleak expectation for the afterlife. So they were happy to adopt some of these traditions in the hope of being reborn in the afterlife and being reborn into a bright and a perfect vision of the world. So the funeral was an important opportunity, of course, to display wealth and status. Coffins, masks, and mummy decorations were bright and eye-catching, involving very costly materials. So we're just looking at the wealthy elite at this point. And here you can see the deceased, this one's a little dark, there's some better ones in a second, alive and awake, and he's wearing a sort of traditional Greek headdress. So people are depicted as perfect versions of themselves, even those who died as children. Now it's hard to see on the screen, but this coffin cover is small. I should have probably maybe put a scale in here, but this is the coffin cover of a child. But as you can see, she's given the adult form. So it is molded of plaster and linen, and this particular piece was made to be placed over the mummy of an unnamed girl. She wears Greek style dress and jewelry normally worn by an adult. And she has an elaborate floral headpiece and a curvaceous adult body. The idea being that if you're going to go to the afterlife, you want to go as an adult, or how you want to be perceived in the afterlife. This, so there are other examples of mummy masks, or more what we sort of think of as more traditional cartonnage masks, like this one. So these are mold made. They would have been made and sort of mass, for want of better terminology, mass produced, as opposed to the Greco-Roman, which were unique to the individuals. So this, of course, is the one that gets the best press, and she is gilded. So the mask is gilt in gold, so that the skin of the deceased mirrors that of the afterlife. Of course, creating a mummy is an extremely elaborate and costly process. So, as I mentioned, was only fully performed for the wealthiest people. And here you can see just a little bit of what the exhibition looks like. So one of the most sought after portions of this exhibition are the mummy portraits. So this technique of portrait painting likely originated in ancient Italy. Like early mummy masks, portrait panels were originally attached to cover the face of the deceased, to provide an eternal but probably idealized face for the deceased. Portrait mummies were rarely identified by name, and we cannot know if the people portrayed actually looked like they do in the portraits. This one is particularly interesting because the portrait is still attached to the mummy. And there are only about 100 of that survive this way. A lot of times the portrait was removed. And what's interesting about this one is that CT scans show that this individual had some folds of flesh, leading us to believe that he may have actually been heavier in life than his portrait shows. And also his CT scan shows that he was older. And so I like to think that, similar to our own traditions, this image was selected to show how this individual wanted to be remembered, right? Think about, the Buffalo News on a Sunday and the obituaries. A lot of times you'll see a veteran who passed away at 95, but the image in his obituary is in his military uniform 40 years ago. So this is a similar process here, that the portrait was painted in life, and this is how the individual wanted to be remembered, and probably not what he looked like prior to time of death. So it's just like our own social media filters in the Greco-Roman period. So Flinders Petry was very interested in these portraits because back then he was interested in race and trying to determine the race of these individuals. And so he studied the Fayum portraits to try and determine that. And he concluded that, Greek settlers in Egypt were this elite population. So Roman period painted panels, these portraits, are also known as the Fayum portraits. And they're just striking images from the ancient world. Their discovery in the 1880s changed what people had thought about art and art history. And although these portraits have been found in other sites, the most complete set is from that Fayum period. And this one is interesting because you can see, if you see it in person, you can make it out a little bit. You can see the remains here of where the wrappings would have secured the portrait to this woman's mummy. So despite modern attempts to characterize these individuals in terms of age, race, or class, they just really resist categorization. And of course, I don't want to give too much away because I hope that many of you will still be able to visit the exhibition before it closes on January 3rd. So I wanted to just give you enough that you were teased, but also to not make it so you don't want to come and visit. So the museum is currently open Friday, Saturday, Sunday from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. We do request that you schedule your tickets either in advance or online or over the phone in order to regulate our capacity in light of COVID-19 restrictions. Of course, that is changing every day. So do not hesitate to check our website or call us on the phone to make sure that we do remain open. Tickets are $19 for adults, $16 for children, seniors, students, and military, and free for museum members.
Alyssa, do we have any questions as we proceed?
Yes, so are all of the museum's floors open? And do you have to be a member to come to the exhibit?
Great questions. So our second, third, and fourth floors are open to the public. Portions of the first floor still remain closed. Our early childhood gallery, our cinema, and our concessions area. But the atrium, second, third, and fourth floor are all open. You do not need to be a member to purchase the ticket. We just ask that anyone wishing to visit the museum, member or non-member, reserves their space online, gets a time ticket in advance just because we are monitoring capacity. So anyone is welcome to purchase a ticket. We just ask that you do it in advance so we can, just make sure we are following all the guidelines. Thanks.
And I know we're limited on time, but Mary says she is curious about the ethical issues related to exhibiting mummies.
Yes, and that's a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for many years, even now. And so what we have tried to do in choosing this exhibition is making sure that every visitor is aware of the context and the background information surrounding how this material got from Egypt to Manchester to Buffalo. And that of course has changed over time, which is why we try and place the material in context of what was going on, not only in the Greco-Roman period, but in 19th century archaeology, specifically in this case, 19th century British archaeology.
And will you have another big exhibit when the mummies end?
Stay tuned. Check our website, sciencebuff.org.
Kathy, you had mentioned, and I want to reiterate it. Did you say that it was free to those who are members of the Museum of Science? There's no additional charge, in other words.
Nope,
Well,
there's no charge, but we do also ask that our members reserve a ticket that is of no cost, just so that they can have a timed entry point. So it's unusual for us to ask our members to get tickets, but in this case, it's more for capacity, but there is a $0 amount if you are a museum member. Yeah.
I visited this exhibit with my wife a few weeks back, and I must say, I'm not that comfortable going into closed spaces, but you made it very comfortable to do so. I sensed plenty of air circulation, ventilation. It was wonderfully laid out. And there were people, but yet everybody was spaced in such a way that I felt comfortable, and all the others seemed to feel as well. Families galore around, kids of all ages, literally, and it's just so well done, which is why we wanted to schedule this in this slot that normally I don't schedule during Thanksgiving week. But not traveling this year, I thought I would make sure we told the community, and more importantly, archive this presentation on the library's YouTube channel, so that it's there. It's another source of it. So we're delighted that you could do this. What else would you like? We've got about a minute to go here. Anything else that well, here's a question. We're living in a time where there's a lot of discussion about science. And people will say, well, don't you believe in science? Well, I would think most people believe in science, but yet there may be certain elements of science that raise questions. What I see happening is that science has been a great process for human beings for the last, certainly since the period of the Enlightenment period, to progress. It doesn't have all the answers, but it does have a process. Would you want to elaborate on that further?
Well, I've worked at the Buffalo Museum of Science for a long time now, and we believe that science creates opportunities and shapes our world. And as I'm a social scientist, I'm an anthropologist, and so for me, and a lot of what we do here at the museum, it is science as a process, right? Critical thinking skills. It's not about, and that's why sort of presentations like this are hard, especially virtually, because a lot of what we do is sort of inquiry-based learning, and we want engagement from the audience, and we don't just want to stand up here and spout facts and figures, which is challenging to a virtual audience. But we hope that visitors to the Buffalo Museum of Science find something that sparks their curiosity, that they want to learn more about, and we can help them and give them the skills they need to think like a scientist in whatever direction that takes them.
Well, that's a good answer. I hope people reflect on it. I'm going to thank you so much again for adding this archival content to the Buffalo story. Basically, the Buffalo Museum of Science. It's just a wonderful organization. I say support it. Every cultural in town is got to be struggling in this period of COVID. So that if you have favorites, please do your best to support them, including the Museum of Science. This program also, I work closely with the Wellness Institute of Greater Buffalo, and they're a co-sponsor of many of our programs, and have been, Phil Haberstroh has been a guest on them often, and I want to note his passing suddenly this past week. He's a good man, and the community's lost a great supporter. So I thank folks for joining us today. We so appreciate this new format. Join us next week, same time, same Zoom link, when we talk to Adam Ziglitz, Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist with the Buffalo News. I want to thank you again for joining us and wish you well for a good day, and be well and have a good and reflective Thanksgiving. Good day, everybody.
Thank you.